Thank you for that lovely introduction. I didn't know I was like such a contested man. All right. So today I'm not going to talk about NLP. Well, not much. I will, of course, talk a little bit about NLP because it's kind of my thing. But for the last about 3 years, I have been thinking and writing on a book about why we shouldn't humanize models too much. It's going to come out any day now, probably, certainly, eventually. Yeah. But there's a lot of things to talk about, and I thought this is probably the right audience, and I would welcome any kind of feedback you have. I'd like to apologize for my voice. I've been, traveling and having trouble with my voice this week. So, just to frame, you all know this, right? Since you've woken up, you've interacted with tons of AI models, right? You have used AI models to search for the trip here. It has helped you organize, unless Sierra did it. You have, had AI models that can help you schedule a meeting. They can't get you out of the meeting, but at least they can make sure that everybody who is supposed to be there gets a reminder and is actually present. And they've pulled up the adorable, puppy or a new baby of your friends to the top of your social media feed that you can click and like it. And it suggested, movies to watch, songs to listen to, everything, right? So AI truly is here. When I was a kid, my teachers always said, in the future you won't have a translator in your pocket at all times, so you need to, learn math, and that aged poorly. Not only do we have a calculator in our pocket at all times, but we actually have a tool that can translate on the fly. So I moved to Italy about 7 years ago. I didn't know anything. And, translation has gotten to a point where it's good enough that we can actually use it on a day-to-day basis. And that's pretty amazing, right? So AI is so ubiquitous that most of the time we don't even notice it anymore, right? Yes, AI news are always either doom or, hype, but on a day-to-day basis, AI is here, and it's very much a part of our lives. But when do we notice it and when do we not notice it? This, Google Translate, is an AI model, but it's just a tool, right? We just use it. You can take a picture, you can talk into it, you can type, and it translates pretty well by now for most language pairs. Just a tool. This thing, ChatGPT, oh my God. This is the cultural uproar of the century, right? This has upended the future of human dating. This has had D&D nerds up in arms because now they don't need a dungeon master. This has, I knew this audience would get this. This has revolutionized everything. It understands, it can tell jokes, it understands us. I can talk to it, I can, lay bare my inner feelings. What is happening? This seems human. This thing is like us. Is it? This is what we're going to talk about, because underlying it all is the same architecture. These are both transformer models. There's not much behind it. It's a cool model, but it's a bunch of matrix multiplication in the end. So why is one of them just something we willingly accept and incorporate into our lives as on a day-to-day basis, and the other one stirs something inside of us? What is this difference? And why do we have this tendency to think of a model that tells us a joke, often a bad joke, as human? Because we have this innate property that we are seeking human signs in everything. Look at that cloud. Doesn't that kind of look like a rabbit? So it's probably a friendly cloud. And that dog, you can definitely tell what that dog is thinking, right? And look, there's a face on the balloon. But let's be honest, it's just a cloud. We don't understand what dogs are thinking, even if they could talk. And if your face looks like that, you should probably go see a doctor. But we're so hardwired to see connections, to see a human face, to see a explainable living being in everything, that it's part of our nature. We've done this forever, right? We have ascribed powers and gods to volcanoes, to the sea, to everything that we couldn't explain. And it's normal. It makes scary, complex, difficult things easier to grasp, friendlier, and just, a little bit more, well, human. So in the past, we've done this with deities, with ghosts, with all kinds of things, and now we're kind of doing it with the latest player on the social stage, machines. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but it has two drawbacks. One, it gives these models powers that they do not have. If I assume a model is human, I assume a whole bunch of features, right? Humans do not just speak, they also do a whole lot of other things. So when I suddenly make the leap from one feature to all of these others, I'm basically crediting the model with way too much. And that makes it difficult to talk honestly about the flaws and biases and problems that these models still have. So what I want to do in this talk is basically look at 6 human capabilities, 6 verbs, if you will, that we oftentimes ascribe to models, and I'm going to take a closer look with you at each of those: knowing, understanding, moving, judging, feeling, and creating, and talk about why and how models are different from us in all of these different aspects, and why it's oftentimes maybe useful shorthand to say a model judges us or understands us, but it's not actually accurate. And like I said, just because you know how to cook a nice pair of scrambled eggs doesn't mean you can make a 5-course menu, right? Knowing one thing doesn't imply all the rest. So let's go through this one by one. Okay. Now, let me get rid of this. Knowing. What do models know? And do they know anything? Let's find out. The beginning of the 20th century was an exciting time. Sweden and Norway almost had a war. The Panama Canal got built. Industry was rising and Berlin was exploding. Berlin went from like this tiny backwater to the capital of Europe in many ways, with culture, arts, sciences all being there. But in many ways, it was still also tied to its rural past. And that meant there were a lot of people who, lived in the rural towns outside, and there were a lot of farm animals, for example, horses. And one of those horses was a horse named Hans. So you probably all have heard about Clever Hans, this horse that was rumored to be able to count, right? So they'd say like, oh, if today is the 2nd of the month and like in 3 days, what is it? And he would go like clump, 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 clump. And it'd be like 5, it's amazing. Hans, you're so clever. And then it took a psychologist to basically, Oscar Pfunks, to basically, through a series of tests, show that no, Hans was actually not very clever. I mean, for a horse, yes, but he did not understand us. He did not know how to do simple math and arithmetics. He basically was just very, very good at reading cues. So he would look at a person and sort of feel their expectation when he got to the point where he should stop clumping his hoof. And then he did. And to us, that looked very much like understanding. So in many ways, Hans was a model, right? He received some input, he produced some output, and we have no idea what happened in that big old horse head of his, but we ascribed all kinds of human traits to that horse. The problem is, as it turned out later, he didn't actually have any knowledge about math or other fields. And that matters, and that has echoes in today's models that, oftentimes have a very narrow set of skills. He was skilled in reading his interlocutors, but don't really know about the subject. Here's an example of a lady walking in a nice sweater. It says knitter through a no traffic zone. Unfortunately, not for her, but for the people on the right of this picture who have a license plate that also reads a little bit like knitter, the traffic camera in this no traffic zone saw this lady walking there and said, oh, this is a car license plate, so these people are in a no drive zone, so they should be fined. So they were actually fined, I think, like 900 pounds. Unfortunately for them, they were like 900 miles away and had no idea about what was happening. And luckily, there was the picture, right? To us, this is blatantly, obviously not a car, right? The left. But to a model, it wasn't, right? The model did exactly what it was trained to do. It recognized letters, numbers, and matched that to a database, and then produced the result. But to us, it's clear that this is incorrect. But the model is lacking sort of a contextualized knowledge. It didn't take into account that there are no car parts around there. It didn't take into account that, people might walk in this zone. So it was way too focused on this one thing. And this is a problem with models. Just because they're producing the correct output, they might be lacking information and they might be lacking knowledge. Now, I should say I suck at throwing things. I suck at basketball. I know very little about it. But maybe I would like to go and, just analyze scenes like this and say, okay, freeze frame, does the basketball go through the hoop or not? Right? And now I have two ways of doing this. One is I can basically get a whole bunch of physics equations that express temperature, the effect of gravity, the Magnus force, all kinds of things, and plug all of the variables in there and then go through and then basically see what is the trajectory of the ball and will it hit or not. Alternatively, you can get a big old neural net. I can take a bunch of videos of people throwing, I can stop them, and then I can basically code it as goes in or goes not. Now, both of these models will do a reasonable job giving me predictions, does the ball go through or not, right? But there's one big difference. If the ball does not go through the hoop, only one of these models can tell me what I could do differently the next time around. And it's not the neural network, right? The neural network can only predict. This is sort of knowledge versus prediction, or causation versus correlation. And really what we want when we talk about knowledge is this causal knowledge, this understanding of how things hang together, because it enables us to explore alternatives. We want something like what made Sherlock Holmes great, right? This famous quote, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Sherlock Holmes is, apart from, obviously having plot armor and everything, is incredibly good because he considers not only what he sees, but also all kinds of alternatives, as ridiculous as they might be, and he can construct them, go through them, and then sort of determine what remains, right? So true knowledge enables us to not only understand causality of an outcome, but also to construct alternatives that would produce the same outcome. And a lot of our models are lacking that. The problem is that we can often not diagnose this in models. Here's a sort of infamous example for models that seem to have some knowledge, but when you look at it, they did the right thing for the wrong reasons. So I see some smiles, probably people who are familiar. This is a paper from, I think, 2017, where they trained a classifier to distinguish wolves from huskies. Why they did that, I don't know, but why not? Turns out this model was highly accurate. Give it a picture with a wolf or a husky, and it says, like, there's a wolf, there's a husky. Very, very useful if you're stuck in the woods and, there's some canines coming your way. Just a second. Oh. The problem was when they looked at, like, what has this model learned, can we understand anything about what makes a husky or a wolf? You know the answer, what makes a husky or a wolf? Snow, yes. Wolves always appear in the snow. So in this case, it gets it wrong because there's no snow around the wolf. So in that data set, that happened to be right. The model got a high accuracy, but it didn't rely truly on the knowledge that mattered, right? So models can be right, but for the wrong reasons. And there are simple limits to what models can actually know. So a good friend of mine is an avid home workout fan. So when ChatGPT came out, I said, hey, ChatGPT, can you generate a 2 kettlebell workout for me? This is a kettlebell. And it did a decent job, but halfway through it said, like, do a 2 kettlebell Turkish get-up. Now, the Turkish get-up is an excellent exercise. You take a kettlebell, you hold it over your head, then you lower yourself onto the ground, you lie flat, all the while keeping this over your head, and then you get back up. Excellent full body workout. If you've ever done one, or if you've even just seen somebody do it, you would immediately know that you cannot do this with 2 kettlebells, otherwise you're going to smash your face in. But 2 kettlebell Turkish get-up sounds like a very, very probable phrase, sounds like an excellent workout suggestion. Problem is, it doesn't work in the real world. And if you had a physical body, you would know this. The model doesn't. Oop. Well, hello, EduRoam. I don't want to connect right now. The other problem is a problem with the US states. So back in the day, there were several problems with the US states. So this was, early 2000s. People were like, oh, we got the internet. We can learn anything from the internet. Well, you can. I mean, one issue is that you cannot learn that Washington, D.C. is the capital of the US because it's never explicitly said in English-speaking media. But you could learn that Georgia borders on Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, but also on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey, which is an extremely interesting world map that you get. Now, to us, very, very obvious, there's a state and there's a country that happen to have the same name. Ambiguity, it happens. But if this is the only thing that we have access to, we end up with a flawed picture of the world. So disambiguating this requires actual world knowledge, right? And if a model doesn't have that, too bad. So saying that models know things is probably a convenient shorthand for saying, well, we've adjusted the parameters of this model in such a way that it can respond correctly to a series of very specific questions. But that's a bit inconvenient to say. So yeah, we say no. It's fine, we can do that. We should just know it's not the same thing as when we know things. So, can they understand us? This is a question that has gone from a theoretical construct known as the Chinese room experiment from the 1980s to a reality. So, just imagine for a second, you get a new job offer. You sit in a room, somebody hands you slips of paper, and there's some symbols on there. You have some reference works to sort of piece them together, some transformations, and you produce other symbols based on that. And, you do that for a while because, well, it pays good money. And after a while, you realize you're pretty good at this. You can do this fairly easily. And after a while, you go like, okay, I mean, the money is fine, but like, what the hell am I actually doing here? So you ask, and they say, oh yeah, this is a newly discovered language. Okay, and you're translating this into a different language, which is great. But even with that knowledge, would you say you understand that language? No, right? You're just following instructions. You've sort of gotten an understanding of the complex system, but you're not really a speaker of that language. And this was a thought experiment in the early days of AI, the Chinese room experiment. But since then, it's become a reality, right? We have these tools that produce large amounts of text output that answer to our questions. And it does look like they understand, but much like this weird job sitting in a room like translating odd symbols, it doesn't require actual understanding. But it's more a form of mimicry. So there's a lot of work on this from the 1980s with the philosophical underpinnings to like recent work by Emily Bender and Alexander Koller, basically showing that, yeah, what these models are doing is parroting, right? They produce something that we interpret as human language, but it doesn't require an actual innate knowledge and understanding. What it does require is a whole bunch of probability distributions, right? What's a likely word at the beginning of a sentence? Well, my. Okay, let's just pick that and see what happens. Here's a distribution over all the words that can follow my at the beginning of a sentence. Let's pick one. All right, what can come after that? Well, we can just keep going, right, until we reach the end of a sentence. Note that we can just do that and we can get a sensible human sentence, but there's no understanding. I'm just using statistics. I'm just using probabilities, right? This is simple probability distributions. These models have been around for 60, 70 years, and what has gotten better is their ability to construct a probability distribution over the vocabulary. Their understanding has not changed. The problem with that is that it's not actually actionable. So if you sat in a room and you got this message and you decoded it and said, like, help, somebody's threatening me with a gun, don't translate this, like, immediately call the cops, but be quiet, you would probably do that, right? Hopefully. But a machine cannot, right? A machine does have no concept of anything outside. As we said before, it doesn't have a concept of a 2 kettlebell Turkish get-up is physically impossible, or, there are states and countries that have the same name. So it might just say, oh, good luck, or how interesting, or something like that. Despite that, these tools actually now routinely fool people into thinking that they are human, that they are having a conversation with a human on the other side. And Alan Turing, bless his heart, actually predicted this, which, by the way, is amazing, right? This is, he predicted this at the beginning of the 20th century. This is like the Wright brothers putting their weird flight thing together and say, like, all right, we kind of did this like 10-meter flight with this thing. In 50 years, we're going to go to the moon, which happened, right? But that was out of the question back then. So this is an amount of foresight that's amazing. His prediction that machines would be so good that they can fool humans into believing that the machines are human most of the time actually did become true. Like in the 90s, this Loebner Prize was initiated, and every year, people tried it. Nobody's really, for the longest time, beaten it. There's all kinds of tricks. You can pretend that you're not a native speaker of a language, that you have some mental health issues, or that you're a small child, or all three. And that will, fool the judges into giving you some lenience when you don't understand something or maybe weirdly switch topics. But now, with these tools, we've basically just crossed this barrier by like a country mile, and nobody cares, right? Like, so this hallmark of like artificial intelligence now is just like last Thursday. The question it raises, though, is what about language is human? So when you see small children learn language, it's a full body effort, right? They speak, they do all kinds of things. So I have a 2.5-year-old, and when he started speaking, one of the first words he said was 9. He's a German child, but he didn't just say 9, he said it like this, 9. So he incorporated the head movement and the voice and everything which he had seen from me, right? So there's a lot more to interacting, to speaking, than just producing the words, right? We are not just language machines. We're not human just because we speak. We speak because we're human, right? There's all kinds of other things that go into talking. And there's evidence from neuroscience that if we lose this ability, not just, because your throat is scratchy, but through a stroke, through an injury, through cancer, through all kinds of things that affect brain regions that help you control speech, it's a terrible affliction. But we have a long history of patients that still function as human beings. They cannot talk, they cannot make themselves understood, but they can have relationships, they can function, they can shop, they can wash themselves, tie their shoes, they don't walk into walls, they can still understand if somebody's crying, they're sad. How they express themselves changes, but their humanity does not. Now, think about what would happen to ChatGPT if it had the machine equivalent of a stroke. What would be left? Not much. The thing is, just because this thing speaks doesn't mean it has automatically mastered the next step to being human. Wittgenstein famously said, even if a lion could speak, we would not understand it. Why? Because the experience of being a lion would be so different from anything we know that even if the lion started to speak English, it wouldn't really register with us. Like, what is the experience? What do they care about, right? Like about resting, finding prey. So just because we have this channel open doesn't change anything about the rest. Sorry, just a second. Oh, that's okay. I'm just going to look for a pair of tissues. All right. Now, the problem is that we're easily fooled by the whole language thing into thinking that we are conversing with somebody intelligent. And this doesn't have to be a lion. It can be a computer. Now, interestingly, these models now can also produce code. Code is a lot like language in a very restricted way, but it has one big advantage. You can run it, and then it either runs or it doesn't, and it produces the output you want or you don't. The interesting thing is that you can prompt these models to write those simple first-year computer science problems, right? Like write a code that reverses a string, write a code that produces the Fibonacci sequence, write a code that does this and that. And these models have seen enough examples to do that. But as soon as you change one variable, skip every second number, or do this or do that, they can't really base this on anything they've seen, so they just go with a likely output, which might still produce a runnable program, but it doesn't do what you asked it, right? With code, we can absolutely and very clearly check this. With language, well, language is a lot more squishy, right? And we kind of innately want to assume that our interlocutor actually does play by the rules. When you talk to somebody, you do assume that they want to talk to you to some degree, that they do talk about things that are relevant, that they're only saying the things that are relevant, but not more and not less. If you talk to somebody about Becky from accounting and like her new haircut, which is really hideous, and the other person looks at you and goes like, yeah, about this weather, it's terrible, right? You'd be like, wait, we were just, ragging on Becky's shit haircut, and you're like, oh, she's right behind me, right? So when somebody breaks these rules of engagement in a conversation, we interpret that as a signal as well, right? We are always desperately trying to make sense about anything somebody says because we assume coherence, we assume cooperation. So we also do that when we're faced with language output by a model. And the problem is we can't just verify whether this is true. There's very nice work by Maurice Jaquesh on humans judging whether something is written by a machine or not. So basically he gave people some descriptions and said, like, one of this was written by a machine, the other one was written by a person. Can you guess? Well, people can guess, but they can't guess better than random chance. So that's pretty good. Then he basically took a couple of outputs that have most often been associated with being written by a human and sort of found a couple of features that they had in common, then trained a model to specifically lean into those features and gave that to people again, and 75% of the time they thought this was written by a human. So they judged the machine-written output to be more human than actual humans. And in case you're wondering, yes, the left one is this optimized model. The other one is an actual human, right? So more often than not, we are standing in our own way. Like our notion of whether a machine understands us is basically a reflection of how we approach language and understanding. Now, all of the things I've talked about so far are kind of cognitive skills, everything in the head, right? But I mentioned that there's more to being human than just our cognitive skills, right? There's all this motion, there's all this like proprioception, this being in an environment, right? When we speak, I know linguistics likes to pretend that language is this cognitive faculty that's completely different and divorced from anything else. We have nothing to do with memory, with psychology, with engineering. Turns out, yeah, you do need muscle control, right? I need to like control my airflow, I need to control my vocal cords, I need to control my jaw, my lips, my tongue. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it that has nothing to do with like the cognitive part of language, but that's just machinery oftentimes, right? But it's part of who we are. And again, when you see toddlers, they don't do it. So they hit their own eye with their thumb, right? It takes like a year for them to turn around on their belly, like even simple things. And it so quickly becomes ingrained that we stop thinking about movement and sensing our environment and being in there. We just take it for granted. And if something moves, we do take that as a sign of intelligence, of like being, of living, of being in an environment. But we don't realize that all of these things are not a given. So this is me last year, around the same time, about to undergo plasmapheresis, where you basically get all your blood plasma leached out, cleaned, and put back in, because I had picked up this lovely virus, courtesy of my son's daycare, that started attacking my nerve ends in my spinal cord, which turns out you need your nerves for a lot of things. So I stopped feeling things. I couldn't, pick up small things. I couldn't walk. I couldn't stand. It affected my voice. It affected my swallowing. It's a very unpleasant experience. One of the things they do to diagnose whether you have this thing called Guillain-Barré is they have you close your eyes, put out your hands, and stand there. And normally you just do this, right? You just stand there. But if you don't have the proprioception, you start swaying around because there is no information from, am I standing on even ground? Am I not? Where is my weight on my foot? You don't feel anything. You're just basically then relying on these little calcium bodies in your inner ear, but they only kick in after like 20 degrees, so about here. So, you go like this. But standing still is, I didn't think about it at all much, but it is an active process. It is something we constantly do. I'm shifting my weight while I'm standing here, even without holding on to the desk, right? This is a constant thing. And the second thing is, as part of the recovery, I guess, they give you a lot of things in small plastic bags. Problem is, if you can't feel your fingers, opening a small plastic bag is like operating a claw machine. It's very frustrating. It's kind of funny, and I guess, it builds character, but yeah. So we do take these things for granted, and only when they're taken away do we realize that this is something that is actually a very integral part of everything we do. Like I said, it even affected my voice and my speaking. I'm fine now, by the way. That makes it incredibly difficult to implement. Whoops. Oh, it does not show this. Okay. Let me just gloss over this. What brings home that this is difficult is that it is incredibly difficult to implement these things in robots. This is a sequence of robots trying to open a door and gloriously failing. They basically just like collapse or like hold onto the handle and then turn themselves over. And this is part of the reason why I'm not super concerned about the robot apocalypse. We just locked the door. But another thing here is that all of these robots are typically bipedal robots, right? There is our innate drive to make these things stand on two legs and resemble ourselves. But why? There's no real reason to do that, right? We just start off from something we know, we give them two legs and make them stand upright, ignoring conveniently or inconveniently the fact that standing upright is actually difficult. It took some monkeys, millions of years to basically get to that point where they're like, wait, if I stand up, I can actually look over the savannah, like maybe we should just do this, right? So it's not that easy. And if you try to write down precisely with numbers and instructions how to even stir a pot, like, I don't know, 3 times, 5 times in a certain direction, it's a jumble of numbers and instructions. It's incredibly complicated, right? Like a simple movement like this involves so many joints, 3 different axes, and like fine motor control. It's incredibly hard. So having this ability is a complex thing, and because it is so innate, it always registers with that. We are hardwired to recognize movement, right? You saw a rat outside earlier, probably because you saw something moving, right? You see the movement before you see the thing. Movement is part of our DNA. But movement also requires an awareness of your environment. And nothing, I didn't want to put a picture for this, but there are these robots that help you clean your floors, right? They go around and they hoover up stuff. They have been then trained to recognize dirt, things on the floor that shouldn't be there, and then seek it out and hoover it up. It's fine until you have pets. And pets sometimes have little accidents and they leave them behind. And then if this hoover comes and like hoovers it up, let's just say it's not pretty, right? So iRobot, the company behind the Roomba, had to employ somebody and say, like, we have a project for you. We want you to recognize poop. So yeah, that must have been a fun assignment. But, you need to have this awareness to basically know what's going on around you and interact with your environment in a meaningful way, even once you can move. But it also, moving requires motives. You don't just randomly, haphazardly move. Now, a couple of years ago, there was this chess player, got his finger broken by a robot. Huge news, the robot uprising. But no, right? Again, what is easier to assume? That the robot actually knew about the human capability of feeling pain and that breaking bones does cause pain and that will influence your cognitive abilities to play chess, or that it just mistook the finger for a chess piece. So just because something exhibits this doesn't mean it actually has all of the requisite surrounding things. Early influence from like self-driving cars, Alvin, which was a CMU thing, shows that you need this awareness of what's going on around you. Alvin was basically trained in CMU. They have a beautiful park behind the computer science building, which is very ugly, but that's fitting. And they drove it up and down this road, but always with a ditch on the right-hand side. Now, when they turned it around, the machine had learned, think about knowledge in the wolves, that the ditch should always be on the right-hand side. Now, turned around, it was on the left. So what did it do? Drove off, right? So having an awareness of your surrounding also requires then knowledge and understanding. And the next question is, of course, well, why don't we make these models better and multitask in these environments? Why don't we give cars and language models a shot together? Sounds great, right? You can communicate with a car, say like, get me to the conference venue, or, they can interact and you don't have to shout, you frickin' idiot, like, where did you learn how to drive? The machine can do it for you. But this leads us into a kind of awkward situation. This is something by a sociologist called Perot, who in the 80s described sort of complex systems that are prone to normal accidents. Basically, they should be tightly coupled and extremely complex, which is this upper quadrant here. There are systems that are tightly coupled and highly complex, but they don't have catastrophic potential, but some of them do. For example, nuclear power plants and airplanes and things like that. Currently, AI is here. It's pretty complex, but it's not super tightly coupled. But if we do put these things together, guess what? We have moved into this quadrant. And as we know from all of these examples of cars hitting people, there is a catastrophic potential here. Again, the problem with all of this is that our tendency to sort of see motion and associate it with sentience is behind all of this, and it's creating a problem. This is a couple of years old. Boston Dynamics showed this robot, by the way, not bipedal, but 4 legs, which is easier. And the first reaction to this was either, oh my God, the poor robot, it got kicked. No, it doesn't have feelings. Don't worry, it's fine. And 2, it will take revenge once the robots rise up. No, it doesn't have a memory. It doesn't have face recognition, right? So just because we have one feature doesn't imply all the others, again. The bigger question here is like, why do we even want robots to be like us, right? Yes, we like things that are similar to us. We do recognize things that are closer to us, but we don't need to simulate exactly something to do what we want. Oftentimes, robots and models in general are better at what they're doing if they're least like us, right? Quick, count from 1 to 100, but like add 2 to every odd number and like subtract 3 from every even number. Can you do that? No, it's almost impossible. For a machine, there, you got it, right? Not a problem. They're good at things we're not, and maybe this is something we might want to keep, right? But we have this innate drive to make things in our own image. So if we have these driving machines, right, they need to interact with us in an environment, so they need to also have a judgment of what is right and what is wrong. Cue the trolley problem, right? Do I run over the 3 orphans or the old lady? I hate this example, but this is the thing that always comes, right? So if we interact in an environment, we need to have a sense of what's right and what's wrong and what's the worth of a human life. I guess the cinephiles among you recognize this quote here. I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Dave, which is from Odyssey 2001. Hal, the computer of the spaceship, locking the doors, not letting Dave back in, right? Evil AI sort of has decided to kill us. This is always the thing. The interesting question is, it's always a 3-step process. We currently have AI. Step 2, something happens. Step 3, AI is killing everybody. Step 2 is always a little bit vague, but it's definitely, most likely, probably going to happen maybe tomorrow. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but doom. Please believe me. Also buy my book. Back to reality. Having judgmental AI could be good. Now, I'm a professor. I do teach for 50% of my living. Actually, all of my salary is based on my teaching. It doesn't say anything about research. That's just my own entertainment. And I would love to have something that can actually, for example, take away the grading, right? Grading is stressful. I want to grade students on their performance and what they know rather than on my impression of them, right? That shouldn't factor into it. So having a machine do this would be fantastic. Well, the UK tried that a couple of years ago, and the problem was that the training data sort of was skewed in a certain way, such that people who came from certain districts or from certain schools were kind of just a priori given a lower grade than others. So these tools had internalized biases and stereotypes, and eventually it came out, the students were granted a redo, but if you're 19 and you're at the beginning of your career and you have to go back, you have a bad final exam and you have to redo everything, it sort of throws a wrench. Now, better judgment probably would have prevented this. Or, even more extreme, in India there was a system that sort of handed out rations to people in need. One of the people who were relying on this couldn't read, couldn't write, used the fingerprint. The system didn't recognize it, nobody was there to speak up for him, and so basically he got denied food rations and subsequently starved. So as much as we like to rag on bureaucracy, any human being with a beating heart would probably take pity at a certain point and overwrite the system, right? how do we do this? How do we encode what we think is right or wrong, right? There are things like the laws of robotics and all kinds of suggestions. Obviously, philosophy has a lot to say about these things, but how do we write these things down? It's not an easy task, right? And again, there's no guarantee that the model would actually do these things in the way we expected. Think about the wolves again, right? Did the right thing for the wrong reasons, right? Maybe by saying, oh, you need to keep your owner safe, it might decide the best way to keep them safe is to lock them in a box and throw away the key because then nothing can happen to them. Right, forget about the whole food and breathing thing. Right? So it turns out machines, even though we think they might be more impartial, oftentimes inherit the same biases we have through the data and through the training process. And this is actually the case that got me interested in is ProPublica basically showed that machines that were trained to make a decision on bail for people turned out to, surprise, surprise, only look at the person's skin color and then make a decision based on that. Because judges had apparently done the same thing. But justice is more than just features, right? Law is incredibly complex. Law needs to encode a lot of information about what we think is right and wrong. It doesn't have, it cannot create precedents with every case. It needs to also play to a society's current understanding of how justice works, and it needs to be consistent because that, makes us trust machines. We found, however, that if you ask machines repeatedly the same thing, in the same conversation, they answer with different things. So they're not consistent vertically. They're also not consistent horizontally. If you have different instantiations of the same machine, they will give contradictory answers just depending on how you started off with, right? And that means you can basically make them say whatever, and then you have your case. Oh, right. This goes to the previous point. We often say legalese in a derogatory manner, but actually encoding in language these complex understandings of what it means to be right and wrong and to do right or wrong by somebody and to hand out justice, that's pretty difficult. And yes, it requires some weird and odd language sometimes. But even if we followed the law example and we were able to enshrine it somehow in a model in a way that, gels with what we do, morals are at least culturally and nationally coded, but also often differ between people, not on the big things. Nobody says killing is right? Or stealing is okay. But there are systematic and subtle differences between people, between countries, between cultures, and by enshrining one set, we're basically excluding another one. I mean, you can go like the CCP and just say, any chatbot needs to follow the basic tenets of communism or otherwise it's not a good chatbot. That's a very clear message, right? But other people might have other opinions. So the whole question of how machines can judge is fairly difficult. All right, we need to stop at 9, right? Okay. 10, yes, the other one. All right, let's talk about feeling. So, some of you might remember, it's football time again soon. A couple of years ago, there was this grand final in the World Cup between France and Italy, Zinedine Zidane and Materazzi. And, at some point, Zidane, the greatest player of his generation, in the World Cup final, basically had a blackout and just headbutted Materazzi. And of course was sent off with a red card. And everybody is like, what did he do? Why did he let his feelings get the better of him, right? He was so close. So oftentimes we have this notion that not having emotions, not being overwhelmed by feelings is a bad thing, right? Econ, a whole academic discipline, has made it their credo that not following your emotions and just being rational is better. But it actually just took 2 psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky, to basically show that, we're not rational. You can get these examples, and then basically every time people say, the second one is more likely, I like the description of Linda as a librarian and activist in the feminist movement better, even though, if you think about it for a second, the probability of that being the case versus the other one has to be lower, just because of like intersection of groups. So no, we're not logical. Econ, I'm not going to say econ is wrong. I have friends that do econ. They're fine. They're born that way. But we also know that taking away emotions, again, from humans with brain damage, with lesions, doesn't actually make us better at making decisions. One infamous example is this patient Elliot, who lost the ability to feel emotions. He was completely left blank with anything that was upsetting or sad, but he couldn't make a decision. Do I take this way to work or that way? On paper, they're equally good. That one is prettier and, like maybe leads me past the duck pond, and I like ducks. But since that is out of the image, he couldn't, out of the picture, he couldn't make a decision anymore. So emotions actually are helpful. Like being this cold machine doesn't always help. If we talk about feelings in machines, most often what we talk about is our own reaction to these things, how this makes us feel, right? And we project this onto machines. Now, if a machine administered a test to me and then afterwards I'm supposed to rate it, people tend to give higher grades to a machine when they're asked on the same machine than if they're led to a different machine and asked on the different machine about the first machine, because they're worried that that machine might take it personally and like hurt their feelings, right? We do project our own inner workings on these machines, and nowhere is this more clear in ELIZA, one of the first language models, the first chatbots, that was basically just this amount of pseudocode that interacted with people and was actually meant to be a bit of a spoof on psychiatry. But people always reported feeling better after interacting with ELIZA, talking to it and being understood, right? Even when they were shown the pseudocode. So Joseph Weizenbaum, the inventor, was kind of frustrated and flabbergasted at like people's insistence that this is not that this made them feel better and that it understood them, even though it was just a machine. And we have, echoes now with people claiming that these models now have sentience and there are, ambers of self-recognition. Now I really need to speed this up. We also should not underestimate sort of the the originality of a situation. So people actually like interacting with a computer until they know it's a computer, right? Once they do, it feels shallow. This is like enjoying a great painting for years and then learning it's a fake. Suddenly you don't enjoy it anymore. Nothing has changed, but you have this knowledge. So for us to know these things, we actually need to have a sense of connection. And we have to have this humanness. And it's more than just responding to emotions. Even if we test these models, we can apply cognitive and psychological tests to basically see, do they have a theory of mind? How do they respond? But that doesn't mean that these machines actually, have any of these things. And the question is kind of ill-posed. If I apply a psychological test to a patient, I am trying to gauge their inner workings, and what they respond to will be the result of their cognitive abilities and their psychological presets. A machine, again, is just responding according to probability, right? So we get the same symptoms, but due to very different underlying causes. Okay, let me briefly talk about creativity, and then we're going to wrap this up. So, this is Garry Kasparov being really distraught because he was beaten by Deep Blue, a chess-playing robot. And he basically accused the makers of IBM of cheating. The robot did something which was so ingenious, only a human could have come up with this. Compare this to the recent troubles in chess where people get, accused of like using anal beads to have like a robot talk to them about, whatever. So it's inverted. So was this really an inspired move by Deep Blue? Well, IBM was just as surprised as Kasparov was, and they went back and looked through it. What they found was they had just reached a situation where there was no correct move predicted, so Deep Blue just took one at random, and that totally threw off Kasparov. So is creativity just accidents? I mean, Bob Ross says, happy little accidents, but Maybe creativity is more. Maybe it is a selection. When I started computer science, one of the professors said, everything already exists. You just have to choose it. And this is why we're going to study search algorithms. It's like, I get it. It's a good hook. But do we really want to say like that's creativity? I mean, The Guardian seems to disagree a little bit. They had this headline. I mean, it's not a robot, it's a language model, but okay, whatever. This was during the pandemic. We had other things on our mind, but still this made the headlines, right? Because it seemed so weird. But if you looked at it in the footnotes, it basically said, no, it did not, right? A human ran this 8 times and then copy pasted it together because the machine itself didn't have any drive, didn't have any inspiration, didn't have any reason to just generate this thing, right? It needed the human to prompt it and to make it do this. So even if we find things, and this is where the creepy image warning kicks in, if we find something in an image model like this, it's a picture, a distorted picture of a female figure that appears again and again and again, and it's called the lobe. It's not actually a ghost in the machine. It's not something that this model has innately. It's just an outcome of the vector space and using the opposite of certain prompts. So models will always respond and they will always produce something. Now, this does raise questions about when we have these tools, what is plagiarism, what is editing, what is inspiration, and where does this lead us, right? This opens a lot of questions in legal terms and also for academia. This was, ironically, one of the major AI conferences banned anything written by large language models, to which the correct response is this, right? Any tool can be used for evil and for the wrong purposes, but that's not what we're banning. We're not banning tools, we're banning incorrect use. Even in Europe, you can buy a gun, right? You can own a gun, you can have it for sports, for hunting. You're not allowed to kill people with it. We're not banning having guns. We're banning using guns to kill people. But on the other hand, having these machines will change the work of creative people. A good friend of mine is a reporter, and she says, yeah, I use ChatGPT all the time, because you know what? I can do the same amount of work in a third amount of the time, and the rest of the time I can spend with my family. So in the short run, it will absolutely change how we approach creative endeavors. But still, it does require the human to use this as a tool to follow their creative vision and idea. It does not come out of the machine itself. So being mindful that I'm over the time, I'm going to try and wrap it up here. I hope I have convinced you that even though machines have a lot of human elements, there is much more to being human, and even though these models seem to possess them, they don't really. The question now is, do we want them to? If we truly, truly want AI or AGI, which is what we now call what everybody thought AI actually already meant, then they should actually have all of these capabilities. But there are risks involved. So do we want to do this? This is the big question. So we need to choose. Do we want to have these single task models that are highly specialized and can do one thing really well, but don't look like us, don't feel like us? Or do we want something that is actually a copy of us and that has all of these traits, with the added bonus that it gets us into the unknown and that we don't have a good answer right now of how to deal with another social actor that looks and feels like us but is not us. So to wrap up, humanizing models is a very normal thing, but it does come with some issues. And it does not, even if we see a human trait in a model, imply that they are human by sort of inclusion of all the other things. It does mean we have to think about what we want AI to be in the future and how we want to treat it. But we don't really have a theory, and this is where I would ask everybody to talk to their colleagues in humanities and social sciences, because I think the future of AI lies in social sciences. They have thought about how to interact with other beings, what morals mean, and how to live in an environment with others that we as computer scientists oftentimes now discover for the first time. So I'll leave it here. Thank you for your attention.